So, with the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act, uh, we can now begin to talk more concretely about Asian American family formation, family life, marriage patterns, so on, in contemporary Asian American. Of course, here I mean contemporary in a very wide sense, let's say from the 90s through today. Now, we know the background of the 1965 Immigration Act in that the law will drastically reconfigure what we think of quote Asian America, and then you put together the Immigration Act, which let's recall allows for family reunification. You put that together with globalization, economic restructuring of U.S. capitalism, as discussed, which means that they're going to be still a cheap labor force, right? Meaning that they're being paid less, but now you have a service economy. And within a service economy, rather industrial economy, you have different types of workers. When it comes to Asians, you're going to see unskilled workers, laborers, as we discussed. But you'll also see a high number of professionals like nurses, doctors, engineers, technicians, and so forth. Okay, so in other words, they're more educated, more skilled, and you have more families coming over. Okay, there's no longer any barriers in terms of gendered exclusion. So obviously, this is going to wield a drastic effect in terms of contemporary Asian American family formation trends. And here we're going to talk about three trends when it comes to post 1965 Asian American families. The first one will be Asian Americans in terms of intermarriage rates. And then we'll talk about generational conflicts, meaning, between, let's say, the first generation immigrant parents versus their American born children. And then we'll talk about something called the transnational family. Okay, so the first thing we'll discuss when it comes to contemporary trends in Asian American family life is the issue of marital patterns among Asian Americans. And here I just mentioned that, and it's noted on the slide, the high rate of Asian American intermarriage. Now, intermarriage is defined as marriage outside one's ethnic group, okay, outside one's ethnic group in which they belong. And Asian Americans have the highest rate of intermarriage. And this is a trend that has been around for decades now. Uh, the last statistics I have is from 2015. And when compared to, let's say, African Americans and Hispanics, the rate of intermarriage among Asian Americans is at 29%. And you compare this with 18% African Americans and 27% Hispanics. But as we'll later discuss, Asian American intermarriage is starting to take a dip. Okay, so it's kind of surprising here, and we'll discuss the reasons or the connections to that. Now, just like we do with all these issues in contemporary life, whether it's education, whether it's work, we have to think about variability within the pan-ethnic category of, quote, Asian American. In other words, take into account the different subgroups that you call Asian American. Of course, I'm talking about Filipino Americans, Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, South Asians, like Indian Americans. Okay, so we have to look at variability. And indeed, you do see variability according to ethnicity within Asian America. Among Filipinos, Koreans, and Japanese, you see highest or the highest intermarriage rates among Asian Americans. And then you see lowest intermarriage rates when it comes to the South Asians, Indian Americans, and so forth. And scholars and researchers believe that's likely due to issues of religion and culture. For example, some South Asians still practice arranged marriages, so you might have a case where um, even though the person is American, even perhaps born in the United States, they might go back to the home country and search for the spouse, right? They'll arrange it. So that matters. Also, religion. You know, now India has a lot of religions, so they're more traditionally. They might be more traditionally based, right? Than let's say the cultural attitudes in the United States, right? Okay. Now you also have to look at variability within Asian America according to gender when it comes to intermarriage. And when you do this, you find that Asian American women tend to intermarry more so than Asian American men. Okay, again, the last statistics that I have is going back to 2015, and when I looked at all the factors involved when it comes to intermarriage, they found that 36% of Asian Americans intermarried. Okay, and that's compared to the lower number of Asian American men who intermarried being at 21%. Okay, but even here you could break it down to subgroups, that is to say, different ethnicities when it comes to those two figures according to gender, right? For example, when it came to the men, which of the groups tended to intermarry more, right? That 21% of Asian American men, well, which groups tended to intermarry more compared to others? Well, they found that Japanese Americans and Filipino American men had the highest rates of intermarriage when it comes to just Asian American men, right? And when it came to Asian American women, the highest intermarriage rates were found with Filipino women and Chinese American women. Okay, so um, here it's showing how there's variability no matter what, right? Okay, now let's recall the assimilationist strategy here that we talked about. Assimilationist strategy was applied specifically to and especially towards pre 1965 immigrant groups, and as you know, historically, um, most of those groups were coming from Europe to the United States. And some of the presuppositions here was that with um, assimilation, you see race and ethnicity mattering less. Why? Because they eventually acculturate, they adopt American values, they begin to leave behind their pre migration beliefs. It depends on the person, the family, but it tends to happen as a sort of objective trend, right? So when you think about marriage in this case, it's important to note that marriage, or intermarriage rather, works towards assimilation. That is to say, you may have first generation Irish who may marry someone who's not Irish or perhaps Italian, right? Or Polish. And indeed, if you ask Caucasians today, you'll see that many of them have a mix, right? Oh, I have a little bit of French, Polish, and German, right? And that's likely to do due to their family history of intermarriage. And obviously, it leads to more just of a assimilated American, where it's hard to say, a specific ethnicity, right? That's especially culturally, it's just America, quote unquote, or American, quote unquote. So again, assimilationist theory is linked to intermarriage, okay? Because intermarriage supposedly is a sign of that weakening of ethnic boundaries between the races in the United States. Once someone intermarries outside, his or her group, well, those ethnic boundaries matter less, right? All right, so how does that apply, however, to post 1965 Asian Americans? Okay, does it lead to this erosion of ethnic boundaries once they do this? Well, it does apply in some studies of social scientists. But as I kind of alluded to earlier, it's interesting to note that some third generation Asian American marriage patterns indicate a higher co ethnic marriages. Okay, sociologists call this in marriages. When you marry someone who belongs to the same ethnic group as you do, that's called in marriage. So even though it's pretty high, let's say with a single first generation that comes here, right, and then marries outside the race among Asian Americans, or also with second generation who are born here and they marry outside their race. You see lower intermarriage with third generation Asian Americans. Okay, so that's an interesting trend here. And it kind of unsettles that assimilationist theory as it applied to pre 1965 groups where you just see rising trends of intermarriage, especially second, third, fourth generation down the line. So now we have to discuss why uh, Asian Americans tend to intermarry, right? And here scholars, of course, interview various subjects who pursue this in their personal lives. They intermarried rather than married co-ethnic. And when it came to women that they interviewed, many Asian American women express worry about cultural stereotypes that apply to traditional Asian cultures to which they belonged, right, in terms of ethnicity and nationality. Okay, for example, what are these cultural stereotypes? Patriarchy, like, patriarchal society, domination by men, or, and, it's transferred to the household or the family too, where you have a dominant husband. And as I mentioned, this is characteristic of some, if not many, traditional Asian gender roles. In America, it's less prevalent to see a patriarchal, a completely and fully dominant patriarchal household, right? A dominant husband. Um, Perhaps in the, let's say, 50s and before that, it may have been more prevalent, but certainly now it's less prevalent. So Asian American women worry about that. And they said that was one reason why they decided to marry outside their race. Now, when it came to Asian American males who intermarried, many of these men felt that, well, non Asian American women were more assertive, westernized, perhaps even more enlightened compared to traditional Asian women. They felt that they may be not as overbearing. They were attracted to that part. And notice how both of them kind of invoke the traditional gender roles that are characteristic of the home country to which either they belong to or used to belong to as first immigration or as second generation, right? Their parents' countries. So it's interesting how it connects to that, right? Traditional gender roles. Now, what about non Asians marrying Asians? We have to also consider that in intermarriage. Well, when they interviewed, for example, Caucasian women, the women they surveyed felt Asian males were less attractive than white males. And meanwhile, when either Asian men are attracted to or already partner with a white woman, it's sometimes involved a form of status exchange. That is to say, um, since Asian males are better off economically and professionally, more successful than other groups, they use this quote capital, right, to use their term, um, to compensate for their lower sexual attractiveness. Okay. Now, when it came to Asian American women marrying white men, interestingly enough, many white men resorted to traditional stereotypes that were connected to Asian women. That is to say, they felt Asian women were just exotic. They were even believers in the society that women who were Asian American were submissive and tended to be more obedient and less troublesome than American women.